Okay, we're going to start the seminar on Electromotive Division's F units, and yesterday I was over at the Toy Train Museum, and I made a promise that if you came to this seminar, there would be something you would absolutely learn about the EMD-F unit that you didn't know prior to coming in here. And I guarantee you'll double your money back to the seminar if you don't leave here knowing something new about the F units on me finishing this up. You will note on the one handout that I gave you, it says at the top, the diesel electric locomotive that did it, the EMD F unit. And as I explained at the museum yesterday, what is meant by that is this was finally a diesel electric locomotive that put steam on the back burner, if you will, for a variety of reasons. No, a single one of these at the time could not pull as much as a steam locomotive, but when you coupled them up, or what they call MUing them together, you had a lot of horsepower there to get the job done. And the other neat thing about the diesel electric is you didn't have a whole bunch of maintenance on these things like you did with a steam locomotive. But who knew at the time that these would be so iconic in today's world? As a matter of fact, there's two business trains that Norfolk Southern has, as well as the Kansas City Southern. They're powered by F9s, and they are absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. And they're powered by ABB A units, at least the Norfolk Southern is. The Kansas City Southern was powered by an ABB A, but they donated one of the B units. They had so much horsepower for their business train, which is 12 cars, believe it or not. They didn't need the extra locomotive, so they donated that to the Kansas City Railroad Museum. But to get us started off here, the Electromotive Division of General Motors F units is the diesel electric locomotive, giving credit to railroads transitioning or switching from steam to diesel, which I just discussed. There were 8 different models of the F unit built from November of 1939 to November of 1960, and they were the following: the FT, the F2, the F3, the F7, the FP7, the F9, the FP9, and the FL9. Now, yesterday, if you were at the museum, you already know the answer to the next question that's coming up, and that is, does anyone know why they were called F units? You can't answer, and you can't answer. But if you don't know the answer, it wasn't for freight, and that's what everyone thinks they were named after. It was actually for 1,400 horsepower. They were actually rated at 1,350, 1,350 horsepower. Electromotive Division uprated it to 1,400 horsepower, so 14 starts with an F, so that's where the name came from, not from freight. So anyone want to take a guess on where the E unit, E as in Edward, got its name from? You probably guessed it. 1,800 horsepower. The E units came with 2 diesel engines inside of them, or what they call prime movers. Each of those diesels were rated at 900 horsepower. So 9 plus 9, there's your 18. So 18 starts with an E. That's why they were called E units. Now, if you go back to the front of the page, FT, anyone know what FT stands for? We know what the F stands for. What does the T stand for? See, here again. I know you got it. It stood for twin. That's exactly what it stood for. Twin meaning that Electromotive, when they originally marketed the FT, it came as a twofer. It came as an A unit and a B unit, and they were semi-coupled together. Now, there's some union reasons for that on the railroads at the time that Electromotive Division of General Motors did that. They had some meetings with the unions. They eventually worked out the problems, and basically what it came down to is the union said, hey, if it's a cab unit, it needs to be populated by an engineer and a fireman. Well, it didn't make a whole bunch of sense where you got an ABBA consist where you're going to have 2 engineers on board and 2 brakemen on board, or 2 firemen on board. So that was one of the reasons EMD called it an FT. The T stood for twin. meaning they came semi-coupled as an A and a B. Now Santa Fe, who had the most of those things, they negotiated right up front with their unions to get rid of the nonsense of each A unit having to be populated, and they ordered all of their units as they could be coupled independently of one another. Now, we move to the next unit, the F2, just simply meant it was the second in the series of internal changes that General Motors or Electromotive Division made at the time that they offered that as a model, F2. F3, same thing. There was actually, some guys say there was an F5. There was never an F5 on the Electromotive Division books. Internally, what an F5 designates, and some said Denver Rio Grande had F5s. It was internal changes only. They moved up to the better traction motors from the F3, and they had a different generator that the diesel engine was driving inside of that locomotive. But anything built after a certain date was no longer an F3, it became an F7. Now, FP7, anyone want to take a guess at what the P stands for? Passenger. That's what the P stands for. So FP7 was the F unit in a passenger version, and all it was it had a little bit of extra length for the steam generators that were used to heat the passenger cars during that time. Then we move on to the F9. That's just, another generation of the F unit itself. And then finally the FL9. Anyone want to take a shot at what the L stood for? Lengthen. That's all the L meant. It was a lengthened F unit, and it was the most different of all the F units because it was dual powered. It could be powered purely by electricity from a third rail on the track, or it could be powered from the diesel locomotive generating its own electricity, much like the dual powered Genesis locomotives that are out there now, or the locomotive that's powering our HO commuter train set. That's a dual powered locomotive that you see there. It either runs on diesel or it can run purely off of electricity. So, and I also gave you how many units were produced of each of those models, and you can see by far the most numerous was the F7. There was 2,366 of those produced in the A unit and 1,483 units produced for the B unit. Now, the brochure that I'm going to give you actually has a breakdown of the railroads, who bought what, how many of the A units they bought, how many of the B units they bought. And believe me, virtually every railroad on the planet owned F7s or F3s. They had them. It was simple as that. So you're bound to find your railroad in this brochure, and as I say, it's broken out on how many they bought. Okay, moving on. And number 4 on here, I only bring up because when we came out with the California Zephyr, and I mentioned that all 3 railroads powered that initially with F3s, I had some people on electronic boards going, well, the CB&Q couldn't wait to get rid of the F3s to go to the E units. Now, I'm not here to badmouth the E unit, but if you look at the numbers here, the F unit outsold the EMD E unit by almost 6-1. Now, there's reasons for that. Naturally, General Motors had a marketing book, and they had a marketing play, and they marketed the E units as purely a passenger locomotive that could get up to speed quick and move the train quickly from one stop to the other. But what the E unit didn't have was the tractive effort that an F unit had. And EMD even recommended that if you were traveling in mountainous railroad territory, they recommended the F unit over the E unit. Now, CB&Q did transition from the F3 in 1955, and they started using E units. Now, the other sales pitch from General Motors at the time was that, 2 E units could do the work of basically 4 F units. No, didn't work that way. They tried that again with the SD90. It just didn't work that way. The F unit was a much more versatile locomotive. It had more traction effort. And I found out in Chicago, I was doing a seminar there, with some ex-EMD guys there, and they said the other reason the F unit was so popular was you couldn't put the gear ratio in an E unit trucks that you could put in an F unit truck. Now keep in mind the F unit is a 4-axle, well, 2-axle truck, okay? The E unit has a 3-axle truck. The front axle is powered, the center axle is an idler, and the back axle is powered. So it's called an A1A truck assembly. Both trucks were designed by the same guy, Blumberg. The guy was an absolute genius. And the neat thing about the F unit trucks, the Blumberg truck that was put on that locomotive, they last all the way from 1939 when the FT came out up to the 90s when the last 4-axle diesel electric locomotive left the erecting halls of Electromotive Division. So this basic design here, actually, if you get into the nuts and bolts, there are 2 major designs of the Blumberg truck that was used underneath the F units. And there was some basic changes as they went up in the roller bearings that were used and the brake rigging. But to go to the higher horsepower, they went to what was called the M unit, the M truck assembly. That will be in your brochure as well. An ABB set of F units had more tractive effort at 5,400 horsepower than an ABA set of E units, which had the same horsepower. Remember, 900 horsepower or 1,800 horsepower for each E unit versus initially 1,350 horsepower of an F unit. But now when you couple all 4 together, that's where you got your 5,400 horsepower. And again, 3 times 18, 5,400 horsepower. But in your information in here, you will see that the F unit had more tractive effort than what an E unit did, with 4 of those on the point, than 3 E units, which EMD said, basically 2 of those could do the same work as 4 of the F units. As a matter of fact, a lot of pictures that we have of CB&Q powering the California Zephyr with E units had 3 of them on the point instead of 2. It's 3. The F unit started out at 1,350 with the FT and F2, advancing to 1,500 with the F3 through F7, advancing yet again to 1,750 for the F9, FP9, and FL9, with a number of the FL9s finally being elevated to 1,800 horsepower. This was achieved all from the mighty EMD 567 or 567 prime mover engine. The number 567 stood for 567 cubic inches of displacement for each of the 16 cylinders of the V-configured 2-cycle engine. This gave the engine a total displacement of 9,072 cubic inches. Think of that for a moment, 9,072 cubic inches. I worked for Cadillac my entire career at General Motors, and the largest engine we ever put in a car was 500 cubic inches. So in effect, each cylinder of this engine was bigger than a Cadillac 500 cubic inch, 567 cubic inches. So that's how they got the horsepower. And the other thing was, it was a 2-cycle diesel engine. But up until EMD came out with this 2-cycle engine, everything in diesel was 4-strokes. This is really cool stuff. You have this gigantic diesel or prime mover, 9,000 cubic inches, that was a 2-cycle. And all EMDs have been 2 cycles up into the latest Tier 4 diesel. Of course, Caterpillar now owns EMD, and the latest engine is what they call a 1010 4-cycle. And again, do the math, it's a 12-cylinder, this 1010, but what it means is 1,010 cubic inches per cylinder. So multiply 12 times 1010, and you'll get what the cubic inch is of the latest diesel from General Motors. Now, Caterpillar said they couldn't make the two-cycle work for the extreme CO2s that were being put out by the diesels. They said the same thing when they were going to have to go to the Tier 3. General Motors still owned EMD at the time, and they made the two-cycle work going away, no problem. But that's a discussion for another day. Structurally, the locomotive was a car body unit with the body as the main load-bearing structure, designed like a bridge, trussed, and covered with cosmetic panels. This so-called bulldog nose was a distinguishing feature of the locomotive appearance and made a lasting impression in the mind of the traveling public. It didn't have what you called a separate frame, the original F unit, just like Chrysler coined the term unitized body. That's what this was. It was a unitized body. Everything worked to support the weight of the locomotive. In France, they call it monocoque. That's what the Genesis is. It doesn't have a separate frame that supports all of the weight of the locomotive like most diesel engines do. As a matter of fact, this photo on the front here was taken at EMD outside of Chicago, a suburb of Chicago, and it's a brace of ABBAs going to, naturally, Santa Fe. They're in the war bonnet paint scheme. And at Santa Fe, they actually label, if you want to really get confused, and we've done it the right way in our catalog, which you'll see in the back of here, they call their brace of 4 locomotives an L, A, B, C. L for the first unit being lead, the B unit being A, the next B unit being B, and then finally the last A unit being C. So they were known as LABC. But that's what a pure Santa Fe fan will tell you. That's how they distinguish their brace of locomotives. Now, the F7 that I put in this brochure for you, road number 304. It's leading the Super Chief. It's in Arizona. It's headed for California. That same locomotive, under a program that Santa Fe did, just amazing, turned into the lead unit that you see here. That is a CF7. The 1 and the 2 locomotives are exactly the same. Now you say to yourself, how in the hell did they do that? It was a lot of work. Story goes on the CF7s when Santa Fe knew they needed some traditional road switchers. The F unit just wouldn't work because the back end, there was no line of sight out the cab. You know, the engineer really had to hang out if he was doing a backup move. Now, of course, backup cameras would solve that problem today, or, you know, radios would help. But it was cumbersome to back an F unit up to do any kind of switching. So they wanted a traditional switcher like the Jeep 7 and the Jeep 9 that GM had started putting into the catalog, or the RS1 that Alco had came out with, which, you know, you had a line of sight. And oh, by the way, these things were also called covered wagons because they mimicked the Conestoga wagons that used to go cross-country from the East Coast to the West Coast, and they could actually work on the power plant inside of this thing as it was moving down the rails. If it got out of sync or something went wrong, they could actually go back in here, under the hood, out of the weather. It would be hot back there for sure, but they could actually work on the engine inside. You can't do that on a traditional hood unit locomotive because the hood fits very tight around the prime mover or around the engine. But they actually pitched their idea to Electromotive first. They said, look, we need 200 locomotives as switchers, and we want to convert our F units into road switchers. And EMD came back and said, can't be done. First of all, you got to do a frame, you got to do this, you got to do that. It's going to be too much money. And oh, by the way, Santa Fe management wanted to do the conversion for $60,000 each. For each F unit they did, they were willing to spend $60,000 instead of, at that time, $150,000 for a new locomotive. EMD came back and said, basically, it can't be done. Can't blame EMD. They wanted to sell new locomotives. So Santa Fe even pitched it to General Electric. They went over to GE and said, here's what we want to do. Can your guys do it? GE came back and said, nope, it can't be done. It's just too much work involved. It won't work. So Santa Fe management pitched the idea internally to the railroad. Cleveland, Texas, there's shots out there. The superintendent came back and he said, yeah, we can do this. We can absolutely do it. And we think we can do it under the $60,000 that you're put at the limit. The bottom line was they'd done 233 F units into CF7s. They're still out there earning their keep, like this little puppy on the front of a stack train. They did it for $40,000 per unit, not the $60,000 that Santa Fe was willing to spend. Now, you wonder why I really like the Santa Fe Railroad? Those boys were bad to the bone, man. They've done good stuff. And these things are holding up to this very day. There are books on the CF7 that you can go out and buy that will tell you everything that they did to an F unit to make it into what they call a traditional road switcher. Okay, F units were sometimes known, I already covered, as covered wagons due to the similarity in appearance of the roof of an F unit to the canvas roof of a Conestoga wagon. The top 5 railroad operators of F units for both A and B were the following. Now this was, again, A and B's, all F units from F2 up to the FL9, and only one railroad owned the FL9, and that was in New Haven. Were Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe with 911 between the two. You will actually be able to break it down in your manual when you get it here on how many they bought of each. Southern Pacific with 646. Pennsylvania Railroad with 373. Baltimore and Ohio with 355. And the Great Northern Railway with 291. And I just talked about the CF5, Atchison and Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad converting 233 F units into traditional road units. These are the F units these are F9s. These happen to be sourced from Canada. This is a Kansas City business train, and the guy who came up with the idea for these was Steve Haverty. Haverty was the president of Santa Fe at one point. He got into one of these with the chairman of the board. He's absolutely a brilliant individual. He's the guy that's credited with bringing back the war bonnet paint scheme, probably the most successful paint scheme ever applied to a locomotive, period. But Mr. Haverty decided he wanted now when he took over, he left Santa Fe because of a little friction between him and the chairman of the board. He started his own railroad company, a consulting company. And Kansas City Southern said, look, we can't let this big brain stay idle out there. So they approached him, they approached their board of directors, and they hired him. And needless to say, what Kansas City Southern was on their knees when he went there. They were ready to be gobbled up by one of the other class ones. Not so much today. What that man did was he was the president, and at one point chairman and president of Kansas City Southern, is legendary. And the very first thing he did on getting to Kansas City Southern is he said, we need a business train, and I want to power it with F units. And oh, by the way, I don't want the ditch lights to just be a bolt-on thing. I want them fitted into the front pilot. And guess what? The mechanical department pulled it off. They fitted the ditch lights into the pilots just like it had rolled off the assembly line at EMB yesterday. And of course, Norfolk Southern has done a business train also. If you ever get a chance that you're somewhere near where either one of these business trains are going to be running, and oh, by the way, they still have the same power plants in them. The 567 is still embedded in those locomotives. So you get that true sound that the F units made back in the day. With that, I've completed my presentation. Does anyone have any questions of something I may have missed? Oh, okay. The question was, he doesn't understand business train. A business train is strictly a way for a railroad to go out to its best customers, or maybe someone that's not even their customer yet, to say, hey, how would you like to ship your goods by our railroad? Let us show you what you're in for. We're going to be making a trip from here to there. A lot of times it could be a Super Bowl game. They've already went out and they've bought tickets for this event. So they'll invite a president or someone that's really high up in a company that they're looking to do business for. They'll invite those guys under the business train. And that's what a business train does. It wines and dines bigwigs to where they go, you know, this is a neat way to ship our stuff. Instead of by trucks, let's put it on this guy's trains because they've treated us real fine here. All right, you guys are free to go. Yeah, Doug.
For more on the F units and other Atlas products, please visit www.atlasrr.com. Thanks for watching.